speaker for today. Teresa Rocha, or Beardall, is a second-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology here at Cornell. She is coming to us, if not directly, via LA. She comes with a JD from University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, as well as a master's degree from UCLA, and undergraduate work at San Francisco State University. Her work is really interested and concerned with quantitative methodologies and the ways that can inform and elaborate questions in sociology and law. And so please help me welcome Teresa to our seminar and thank her for a really engaging set of topics for our final session of the seminar.
So I first want to just say, I'm sorry you're not going to see like the pretty font version because I just am not super tech savvy, so I can't show you the pretty font that I see. And font matters to me. But I want to start by thanking everyone for being here today. My name is Teresa Rocha Beardall. I am a second-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology. I'm also pursuing a graduate minor in American Indian Studies. And yes, I've been to all of these different universities. If there's kind of like a big American Indian program in this country, I did a degree there. And I'm very proud of that. And so I'd like to start by introducing myself to all of you in a different way and letting you know that I'm Oneida and Sault Ste. Marie on my mother's side. I'm Mexican on my father's side. And I do that because it's important for people who don't know me on a personal level, and I don't know you on a personal level, to understand that my mom made her way to California from Wisconsin as a teenager, and my father made his way to California from San Luis Potosí as an undocumented immigrant looking for work. And so many of you know I'm from California, and that's kind of how those two places came together. I was born in San Diego and then raised amongst really kind of every Latino neighborhood there is in Los Angeles, which is the hometown that I claim. But also in between Los Angeles, the Manzanita Cumina Reservation, and then crossing the US-Mexico border at least every other week to my family's small home in Tijuana. So my world kind of operates there. And I say that to you so that you have a better sense of how these very different but very interconnected worldviews shape the way that I think about law and inequality across borders. And that's really kind of the crux of this talk, right? Law and inequality across borders. I also want to pause and express my gratitude to the Cayuga people whose territory we're gathered on, as Troy mentioned. Also to the American Indian Program for everything that they do for me and every other student here to keep this place running. And then also to our invited campus guests and all of my sociology babies who are here. It's really wonderful to see you here. And I'd like the audience to know that you all have spent your entire semester thinking about structural inequality and social problems in the US, and I'm very, very, very proud of all of you. And if you're new to the American Indian Program, welcome, and we hope you will be back again soon to talk with us. All right, so I want to get started. The title of my talk is More Than a Hashtag, Reading Demisprudence in the Voices of Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More. Right. And so we can get started by really trying to get ourselves as close to the same page as possible regarding social movements and the legal meaning amid Black and Indigenous demands to be seen, to be heard, and to live. This is a conversation about making legally visible the unique socio-legal demands of two communities that are repeatedly made invisible. I do so, however, carefully aware of the global attention focused right now on violence abroad, as well as internally with student-led social movements taking place at Yale, Mizzou, Ithaca College, and even here on our own Cornell campus. And so while I agreed to do this talk last academic year. The week that it happens to fall in, I think, is really important. And so I don't want to jump into the conversation that I had originally planned without kind of laying the foundation and making the connection internationally into our own campus environment. So while the conversation doesn't directly comment on bombings in Paris or Beirut or Baghdad, it does touch on a similarly situated conversation regarding selective grief or an empathy gap. And so this gap is described, for those of you who are interested in reading about it more, in an Atlantic article that ran this past Monday entitled "The Empathy Gap Between Paris and Beirut." And there, journalist David Graham describes the process of how one act of violence in the world can overshadow a similar, concurrent violent act. And Graham attempts to better understand how national attention becomes largely focused on American or European city attacks, perhaps because of a familiarity of our ability to see ourselves in those places and in those people. And then familiarity then with the demands of Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More is critical in this way for those of us here in the room who are not as familiar with the demands of these movements, right? So it's our job to become familiar. And in the same moment, student-led social movements continue to mobilize at our campuses to bring awareness and accountability to the mistreatments of students of color and institutional racism. Duke sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva shared a public Facebook post last week on November 11th, in which he discussed the presence of systemic racism at HWCUs, or what he calls historically white colleges and universities. He writes, quote, "These institutions reproduce whiteness through their curriculum, culture, demography, symbols, traditions, and ecology, within which people of color are still treated as second-class members, either by the statues that adorn those campuses, the names of their buildings, and the traditions that are in historically white colleges and universities, or even by directly disrespecting people of color on those campuses by calling them names, mocking them, or harassing them in old racism fashion," end quote. And my awesome students understand this particular type of exclusion quite well as they explored another Ivy League university as a case study on their first prelim. And they analyzed the daily lived experiences, conflicts, and aggressions, both micro and macro, for a Black male student through the 5 sociological perspectives. So I'm excited that they're all here because they are really informed in this conversation in a different way. So I invite you then to consider the power of selective grief in our own nation and to wonder about the violences that we allow and those that we do not. Do we see Facebook profile photos mourning the lives murdered by police or the Indigenous sisters that go missing along our own borders? We do see some, but certainly perhaps not as many of those photos that we see in the past week splashed with the colors of the French flag, right? To think about selective grief on historically white institutions. All right, so everyone has a seat, do you want? Yes, come in. Come in. I can also stand and have this chair. Okay. Here, you can have this one. Yeah. Okay, so over the past few years, hashtags and demands for legal change have flooded social media. For some, these rallying calls are deeply connected to the change they envision in the world. For others, these calls are frustrating and they're problematic. And today I would like to focus on the rallying voices that fuel the critical consciousness of both Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More. I focus on the discourse of those mobilized voices because doing so keys into some important themes from the field of Indigenous studies and interrogates the presumption that Western law has a monopoly over the production of knowledge on these critical issues of violence. These voices mobilize within the politics of recognition and refusal, as articulated by Glenn Coulthard in his book Red Skin, White Masks, and Audra Simpson in her book Mohawk Interruptus, respectively. And we know that Glenn just visited us, so it's really nice to kind of use his work as well. Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More demonstrate a powerful form of legal reckoning, performing a critical role in unsettling traditional discourse on legal authority. My goal is also in this talk to unsettle, but in this case to unsettle the popular criticisms against both movements. I do so by situating their demands within a legal framework called demisprudence, developed by law scholars Lonnie Bonnier and Gerald Torres, who is faculty here at Cornell Law, which focuses on the lawmaking authority of everyday people. And I've thought a lot about what it means to give this kind of talk with a super diverse audience and within an Indigenous Studies seminar. And so I'm really structuring my remarks in this way. I'm going to start with legal scholarship on whiteness that looks at the subordination of both Black and Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to move into some of the specificities of Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More, and then bring us back to legal scholarship on what demisprudence is and how it works and why it might be important for this conversation. So to start and figure out how and why I see Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More in conversation together, I really think one must begin by examining the subordination of both communities by the law and in the law from the foundation of the United States. And to do so, I begin with the work of legal scholar Cheryl Harris and her 1993 Harvard Law Review article entitled Whiteness as Property. This landmark piece is essential to my discussion for three reasons. The first is that Harris demonstrates that the law as we know it today is not at all objective or impartial, but instead is a social institution by which the privileges and benefits of whiteness are affirmed, legitimated, and protected, and thus govern the background against which all legal disputes in our nation are framed, argued, and adjudicated. The second point that she highlights in her work is that the formation of property law is rooted in the right to exclude. Harris argues that whiteness is premised also on this right to exclude, which is productive for us to consider in this particular moment together. And we should ask ourselves then, how and by what means have Black and Indigenous bodies been excluded, been erased, and denied a basic right to live? The third point that I want to draw out from her very long and wonderful scholarship is that she argues, quote, that the origins of whiteness as property lie in the parallel systems of domination of Black and Native American peoples, out of which were created racially contingent forms of property and property rights. In short, the Black body was rendered property in the form of chattel slavery, and the Native body rendered incapable of possessing property rights, thus sanctioning the genocidal conquest and erasure that allowed the legal system by which the land was taken to be consummated. In both cases, this violence governed a complicated set of social relationships. And here's where my training in the law then comes into my training in sociology. And I really focus on this idea of the social relationships that these moments produce. The social relationships I look at are those between first peoples of this land, European colonizers, and the African arrivants. Relationships that I argue later coalesce into formal written law. Harris outlines for us what she calls, quote, the dual and contradictory character of slaves as properties and persons, end quote, in ways that are striking to someone who's an American Indian scholar, who is trained to understand the dual and contradictory character of what it means to be a domestic dependent nation. And so what that is it's the reality that tribal sovereignty is not at all able to express itself freely within its own tribal territory, but instead is severely limited to internal matters that is always subject to congressional approval. So it's dual and contradictory. Harris goes on throughout her work to explain that the conquest and occupation of Indian land was wrapped up in the rule of law. The law provided not only a defense of conquest and colonization, and so for those of us who know this law, we can think back to the 1823 Supreme Court case, Johnson v. McIntosh, but also thinking about a naturalized regime of rights and disabilities and power and disadvantage that flow from it, so that no further legal justifications or rationalizations were required or even allowable. Land title belonged solely to the conquering nation, subordinating the position of the American Indian politically, economically, legally, and socially. Moreover, property in Cheryl Harris's analysis moves beyond our thinking about property as a physical thing, such as a home or a car, and allows us to understand property as a set of rights, particularly what I mentioned before, the right to exclude. So whiteness then, in this sense, is not a physical thing, but rather is a set of rights. And property, then, in its ability to understand whiteness as property, is the ability for the exclusion of Black and Indigenous peoples and their communities from legal protection. So when I say whiteness is property, I'm not talking about a physical piece of property, I'm talking about the bundle of rights embedded in what whiteness means, that then becomes embedded into what the law is today. So with Harris's work kind of fresh on our minds, we're able to understand subordination within the law as a set of social relationships that continue today. And I would argue require us to look to each other in this contemporary moment for answers and collective resistance. And while I do not at all intend to omit the long, violent histories that follow this construction of whiteness as property in Harris's work, I do want to just use this kind of framing to set up the conversation that I had originally written this paper for, which kind of assumed that this sort of dialogue was all normal to everyone who would be reading the paper and or who would be sitting here. But this is a super diverse audience, which is why I wanted to start with Cheryl Harris's framing. So working from the premise that the law is embedded with a particular type of white privilege that historically denies Black bodies protection from routine state violence, and Indigenous bodies the protection from genocide and erasure, one can see the emergence of a subordination of the body and a subordination of the right to secure land and title. I also pay close attention to the level of visibility or invisibility to the positioning of Black and Indigenous communities in regard to how their injustices and demands are unseen. And while we arrive together to a discussion of Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More, I want us to consider the implications and subordinations that are not seen and that are not heard and that are not perhaps tweeted about, right? Okay, so a little bit about the movement backgrounds. I'd like to first highlight the origins of each movement, and in particular, both of their origins and founding by women. Persistent legal inequality is a central demand to both of these movements, including, but certainly not at all limited to, the accountability for institutional violence at the hands of law enforcement and of a state refusal to honor treaty responsibilities to land, water, and people. And some of these similarities, I think, if you're not familiar with one or the other, you wouldn't know. And I, of course, want to key in on the women part. So, important to me. There's a picture here that you can't see of Black Lives Matter, which I think is interesting that it's not showing here. So I'm going to move.
Oh, there.
Oh, there you see the I Don't Know More picture. Super weird, but there is a picture, and let's see if it comes up in another slide. See how the photos of Black Lives Matter get erased from the PowerPoint. So there is a photo on my version of this, but maybe this screen is symbolic in a lot of other ways, right? So I want to start with reading a little bit about Black Lives Matter. February 26, 2012 was a cool Sunday evening in Sanford, Florida. A young boy made his way to a nearby 7-Eleven shortly after sunset for an iced tea and Skittles. He would never make it home that night. And unarmed, my students know that I get teary about this sort of stuff, so it's who I am. An unarmed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin would be followed and then murdered for appearing, quote, real suspicious. Many Americans, particularly Black Americans, carefully followed the legal proceedings that unfolded for the next year and a half. The jury deliberated for 16 hours, finding George Zimmerman not guilty of second-degree murder and simultaneously acquitted of manslaughter charges. A deep sigh of anger, fear, and resentment could be heard around the country, both for and against the jury decision. Some took to the streets, some turned inward to family and close friends, and others turned to social media. One Oakland, California activist, Alicia Garza, would log on to Facebook that night and write, quote, Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter, end quote. Garza's close friend, Patrice Pillars, read this message 300 miles away. She shared the post and added the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Third co-founder Opal Tometi describes the hashtag as a rallying call to engage activists in a larger conversation about racial injustice. She writes, it was very important to have something that was broad enough that captured a range of violence, and we needed to be able to speak to all of that violence. And the movement was born. Meanwhile, a group of 4 women in Saskatchewan, Jessica Gordon, Sheila McLean, Sylvia McAdam, and Nina Wilson, were hard at work organizing a series of teach-ins on critical Indigenous issues surrounding the Canadian Bill C-45. Bill C-45 was introduced into the Canadian Parliament in October 2012, and a rallying event was scheduled a month later under the slogan, Idle No More. Activists in this movement focused their efforts on 3 particular portions of Bill C-45. The first was what is called the Indian Act, the second, the Navigation Protection Act, and the third is the Environmental Assessment Act. And what this bill was doing was changing 44 federal laws without proper parliamentary debate or even consultation with First Nations. Which is all required by the Constitution of Canada, but that didn't seem to matter at all. And of course, word spread very far and very fast. One founder, Sylvia McAdam, a Cree lawyer, describes feeling furious about the bill because she witnessed firsthand the horrors of losing her own family's traditional hunting grounds. She linked her experience with her legal training and shared with her friends, quote, something in law called acquiescence. That means that if you're silent, then your silence is taken as consent. And all of us founders agreed that we couldn't be silent. That people, our people, have a right to know about this, end quote. Jessica Gordon agreed, another founder, and they decided that they would be taking direct action. And so they set up a series of teach-ins and demonstrations. On December 2012, chiefs representing the Assembly of First Nations were not permitted into the House of Commons in Ottawa to discuss the bill. So not only were they not consulted in the original framing of the bill, they were not allowed to the discussion that would follow just 2 months later. Chief Teresa Spence of the Attawapiskat First Nation began a hunger strike on that action day in December 2012, spurring the growing movement even further into the social media spotlight, but then it started to bleed into the US in a really profound way. And this movement was off and running. Again, you won't see that picture, but I'll show it to you afterwards. So despite origins in key legal moments, in transparency, in who the founders are, and what they meant to accomplish, popular critique of both movements persists. Black Lives Matter, for example, is criticized for being too Black-focused, too violent, too angry, lacking clear demands and leadership. I Don't Know More, on the other hand, has been criticized for trying to do too much, for subverting governmental negotiation processes, for disrupting commercial enterprises such as oil and resource extraction, and as well as my favorite, for being too peaceful. So you can see and kind of hear that the critique moves and bends in order to situate these movements as social chatter and something that's happening outside of the law. This type of critique reminds us again of Cheryl Harris's work and her discussion of the law's subordination of Black and Indigenous communities as a set of social relationships within which whiteness is affirmed, legitimated, and protected. This criticism is embedded in legal whiteness that utilizes a set of property rights to exclude these voices from framing how legal disputes should be argued and should be adjudicated. Note also the kind of dual and contradictory character that we discussed before in terms of understanding how the Black body could be made into property, and the dual and contradictory characterization of how the Indigenous body could be rendered capable of giving up its property but not having it. So then this brings me to kind of where my original writing of this paper this summer began, which is here. And so what I look at is this idea of demonstrance, which is the law-making power of collective organizing. It encourages deeper analysis of both of these social movements. From this framework, I argue that Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More are creating critical culture shift and directly challenging the subordination embedded within the law and legal institutions. They are doing so by constructing legal discourse and challenging a belief that courts and legislators have a monopoly on what the law actually is. These movements are themselves demanding a radically different set of values, norms, and even laws. But I started this paper by wondering to myself, are we listening? And if we are listening, do we know how to listen to both movements together? Legal scholars Lonnie Guinier and Gerald Torres developed demonstrance as a methodological tool to closely analyze three successful civil rights and social justice movements of the 1950s and 60s. The first is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The second was the Montgomery bus boycott, and the third was the work of the United Farm Workers. Guinier and Torres clearly demonstrate in their work that social activists of this time shaped how the legal teams that worked with each of these organizations represented their claims in the courtroom. But what I'm trying to do is push their framework that's historically bound in the 1950s and 60s. I'm trying to push it to the contemporary moment to be able to analyze the legal demands of both I Don't Know More and Black Lives Matter. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I disagree with one kind of key premise about demonstrance, and the disagreement is that these movements do not actually need to be linked up to a legal elite or a lawyer or some sort of legal partner in order to be understood as legitimate. I'm also doing this hopefully to collectively refocus scholarly attention to the demands made by both movements, despite this dissonance that suggests that the legal demands are nothing but emotional outrage toward a legal system that our communities simply cannot understand. So through the application of a 4-element test of demonstrance, we can begin to listen and identify how the voices of Black Lives Matter and I Don't Know More are actively creating and shaping law. And I'm arguing that they do so in 4 different ways. If you read law review articles, you'll read like 80 pages about a lot of stuff, but then you come away at the end wondering what the stuff is. And I see people nodding their head. So what I've done is really just kind of, with a fine-tooth comb, gone through this literature to be able to pull out some of the key critical factors of what demonprudence actually is. They're establishing a movement that represents a constituency of accountability. It's not about one localized community. It's not about me and the people in this room, but it's a broad constituency of accountability. The second is that they're pursuing legal change that's focused on fundamental values of justice. So this isn't about looking at a law and saying, well, the law itself isn't so bad. There's just one tiny bit that we can kind of change a little bit and then it'll all be fine. That's not what these movements are doing. They're pushing us to have a radical shift in what we think law really is and who it's for. The third thing that they're doing is they're challenging and expanding what qualifies as formal legal authority. What they're doing is they're saying the law doesn't always come out of a courtroom. It doesn't always come from the Supreme Court. Legal authority comes from the people. It comes from our voices. It comes from our mobilization. It comes from the moments in which we're working together and thinking through very complicated issues in the same room. The fourth thing that they're doing is they're setting the stage for successful rule change with legal partnerships. But they're not placing their movement demands in the hands of legal partnerships and in the hands of lawyers and saying, okay, you are the best ones to deal with this issue. Instead, they're saying, we are the best ones to deal with this issue. If you would choose to join up, there's a way for us to work together. But why use demonprudence in the law? As an analytical framework, it is a logical fit, I think, because it centers the mobilizing demands of social movements and their relationship to the law as a site where legal authority is constantly being constructed. So it understands the law as something dynamic, not static. Therefore, it can allow us to analyze the collected demands of particular constituencies across time. So this kind of traditional model on the creation of law just doesn't do this. It doesn't allow the dynamism that these two particular social movements are demanding of all of us today. This direction that you see here clearly indicates how the claims of a movement must be re-articulated by legal elites in, quote, legitimate spaces. And that is normally with judges and courts in what we call jurisprudence, or within Congress and statutes in what we call legisprudence. Yet we know from Bonilla Silva, Harris, Cheryl Harris, and the collective demands of both of these movements that jurisprudence and legisprudence are historically white institutions that fundamentally subordinate that which questions the benefits of whiteness. So then this model doesn't make sense to me and to many other people. In the demonprudence model, however, jurisprudence and legisprudence are brought directly into conversation with the demands of everyday people. Although described in the scholarship as a way to understand how lawyers and everyday citizens make law together, demonprudence for me is key to understanding how particular social movements make legal meaning from their own claims before litigation, regardless if litigation ever happens. Litigation is not the important part. But I also understand that this by no means is a solution to our collective concern to legalize state violence. But I think what demonprudence does is it lends us a vocabulary and a way to reconstruct how and where everyday people can and will shape their legal realities in the face of injustice. And I should also say that this is not any kind of true apportionment of how I see demonprudence fitting in a pie model. It's just that, as you can already tell, I'm not a super techie person, so it already took me a million years just to be able to make a color-coded pie graph. So if I was going to redo it, this is, you all use the little click shapes right on PowerPoint. If I would redo it, demonprudence would take up 99% of this circle. And jurisprudence and legisprudence would be just 0.5. So the apportionment is not, this is just my ability to not know how to move the little click-ons. And so while I'm hopeful, because those of you who know me personally, I'm an eternal optimist, while I'm hopeful that a demisprudence analysis privileges the voices of constituencies of accountability, I'm also deeply realistic and heed Audre Lorde's imperative that genuine social change cannot come from an attempt to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. Similarly, I am mindful of David Correa's book, Property of Violence, where he thoroughly documents the mediating effects of law, but also its production of social conditions that create this conflict in the first place. Within the application of demisprudence, I do not attempt to conflate two very different and two very powerful social movements. Instead, I'm trying to re-ask questions concerning the ongoing resistance of the colonial project, grounded in Chickasaw scholar Jody Bird's Transitive Empire. And I ask, how do we best situate these demands among Indigenous peoples and arrivants for socio-legal change? So the relationship between Indigenous peoples and arrivants is very important to my consideration of how demisprudence could potentially lend us a vocabulary. How can one privilege the demands of Idle No More for protection of water and land, accountability to treaties, and an open resistance to the terrible violence more broadly against missing and murdered Indigenous women without negating the claims of repeated atrocities of state violence against Black lives? How do we do that? Similarly, how can one privilege the necessary and critical demands of Black Lives Matter in a way that also recognizes Indigenous erasure as settler colonial violence? And again, this is all coming from Jody Bird's work on Transitive Empire, really profound in my way of thinking about this conversation and these legal relationships. So in conclusion, essentially what I'm arguing is that reading demisprudence into these kinds of questions is really difficult, complicated questions that don't have very clear answers, but do have a lot of clear tensions, provides us a meaningful method to understand these complex issues in key discussions within Indigenous studies. And some of those discussions involve what I mentioned before, the politics of refusal in Audra Simpson's work, the politics of recognition in Glenn Coulthard's work, and then other conversations of violence and settler colonialism, resistance and dispossession. And perhaps demisprudence may also invite us to transform the idea of what selective grief is in our own nation's history, and also to reinterrogate what historically white institutions are and how they govern the social relationships by which we as everyday people interact with each other. And for Black Lives Matter and Idle No More, this shift in understanding is possible, I think, in this way. By interrogating their collective discourse in the same way lawyers and scholars carefully analyze Supreme Court oral arguments and the resulting decisions, I think we can really begin to understand the way social movement actors offer legal meaning. So rather than always looking to the Supreme Court decision to find the true meaning of what's going on, maybe we can start listening to these voices. And that brings me to the end of some of the thoughts I think necessary to be able to have this kind of conversation and productive dialogue on what it means to think through Black and Indigenous resistance and erasure together without negating one or the other. And so I also understand that this is just like a tiny scratch at the surface of all of these issues. But I hope at least I've put enough vocabulary and enough kind of literature on the table so that we can have a productive conversation about what this means to understand law as a set of social relationships, but also what it means to understand historically white institutions as being embedded with the property privileges and benefits of whiteness that don't necessarily invite us into that type of conversation. That's it. I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, again, thank you, Teresa, for a very rich and generative set of comments. We'll spend about 15 minutes in the discussion with some questions and or comments. I'll reserve mine, I guess, for later.
And maybe if, I know people need to leave, so maybe if people need to go now, I don't mind if that happens too, so that those who will stay, can stay. I know everyone has like real lives and places to be, so if you need to go, I'm not offended.
T. I have that on my mind.
For my Soch babies, if you have prelims, they all go over here, and there's a pile over here.
I'll put up my hand for you.
Okay.
She wants to wait till.
Okay.
What's that?
Teresa, I have a question. Thank you for.
Wait until the students get out.
I was just trying to be time effective. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. But I want to like. I just want to let people go who need to go. Okay, so now that people who needed to leave made their exit leave, now we can. That's okay with you, Troy? To start?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation again. Very thought-provoking and really rich, interesting intersection that you're pursuing here. I have a kind of a question. I have a question and a comment. So the question is, with prudence, I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's a very like interesting way, and we kind of talked about how it relates with other ways of thinking about re-articulating or pushing back against legal political definitions of the law. And how, so this is the way you conceptualize it outside of being put into practice through legal political elites, right? You know, according to Taurus, that's how it's traditionally done, and you're moving it out of that realm. Is there other evidence of this kind of prudence outside of like some of these movements that we might have sympathy with? Like on the opposite end, you have conservative states' rights, people who are articulating like a limited government, and I could see the whole Tea Party phenomenon being also part of this prudence, you know, the way in which they push back against the law, and arguably have taken control of the House of Representatives, and that whole messiness between the representatives and their constituents and some of the movement actors across that landscape seems to be another example of Demon's prudence in the way that you're articulating it. So it'd be interesting to consider some of these other types of movements with this new categories, with this new concept that you're putting, this new approach to Demon's prudence. The concern I have, and I had talked about this before, was that when you're looking with Harris's work and she's talking about domestic dependent relationship, and then you move into Idle No More, into the Canadian context, I wonder how you can bridge. I think there needs to be like a linkage between the way in which land and resources are understood in the U.S., you know, the deprivation of Indigenous rights to own property, and then how that, I mean, there's parallels and pretty much just a reverberation of that in the Canadian context, but that linkage I think would be important for linking that work to the Idle No More movement. And then finally, I guess at the end I would like to see how this new Demon's prudence says something about property, you know, in the end, because you begin with property, like how is it now redefining property, both in terms of like, you know, us as like people, like in the Black Lives Matter, like people as property, and then as the environment as property. And I think that would be like a really interesting way to place of meaning. Sorry, my question's bad because I'm sitting on the floor.
No, there's like 5 different things, different topics that I wrote down, so I'll talk about a couple of them. So just to clarify, Demon's prudence is not my concept. It's Gerald Torres' and Lonnie Mears. And it's an imperfect concept in so many ways, right? So that's why I said there's like 80 pages to read, and then you wonder what it is at the end. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give it a structure by which to find its applicability to have generative conversations about what it means outside of the traditional sociology literature on social movements, which is really kind of grounded and localized on the ground mobilization, whereas we live in an era that's very social media driven. And so what does it mean to have really broad reaching conversations about legal injustice? And so I'm trying to use demisprudence in all of its imperfections, because the law itself does not operate within a theoretical framework by which to bring this conversation in. And so, although it's imperfect, it is this thing. It's kind of like they left the window open. The law left the window open. So I'm trying to like go through the window and then break the whole wall down and say, well, there's actually more here. If we can together figure out a generative way to give it some meaning, our meaning. So an example of where else I see this happening, and I was talking with Lisa about this yesterday, is that I see this very same conversation and reaction against state violence happening within the Latino community, and I'm also trying to think about how conversations around deportation and state violence on Latino families is resisting state violence in very similar ways through social movements. And so I think about the relationship of resistance against deportation, particularly within the Dreamer movement, also those young people who traveled to Mexico and then crossed the border as undocumented people, who really put their bodies on physical borders and said, where is the law now? Whose law? My law or your law, or a whole new way of seeing the situation? So I'm trying to think about how that comes together in this conversation. The comment on the Tea Party as being evidence of demisprudence, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of crux of these terms and the implications of how and where we use them. It's open for everyone to reshape the law the way that they want to, whether we think it's a great idea or not. But my argument is, if we sit back and we don't work together to figure out what the hell we're doing here together, then those conversations become privileged. And that doesn't make any sort of sense to me when we know historically they've always been privileged. So yeah, that is evidence of demisprudence, but it's not the kind that I'm invested in personally or academically, but I'm very aware of, so I appreciate you bringing it up. Yes, for those of you who are Indigenous studies scholars, you know that I Don't Know More began as a Canadian movement. I'm talking about the US experience, so in the longer version of my paper and another version of this talk, it was specifically linking, so I started just at the central argument slide, which for you was slide 10. I start there, and I fill out the contours of what it means for I Don't Know More to have a presence or not in the US, and why it might be a useful way to think about Indigenous resistance, which we know happens in the US, but doesn't necessarily happen under one overarching hashtag, right? So we know it's here, and we know it's powerful in all of our communities. And so I spend a lot of time in the longer version of that paper fleshing that really important divide out, and also kind of resisting the idea of borders. And what does demisprudence say about property? In also the longer version of the paper, Cheryl Harris is assumed as you already know it. So I don't take the time, at least in this kind of forum, to bring you back to property again, because the thing that I need you to understand is that the law is historically a white institution that's embedded with protecting the benefits of whiteness, and the idea of understanding the law in that way is the important part of it. So in the larger paper, I would assume you've already read Cheryl Harris because she's in the footnotes. And I just talk about her more here in order for other people who may never have thought about the law as being an historically white institution, so that we can get on the same page. Oh, sorry, you're here.
So you talk about how, like, you know, I just think about the different movements of, like, demisprudence. Like, I feel like an example of a success of that was, like, the civil rights movement, where, like, a social change of the social movement really brought about transformations in law successfully, like, through the court systems and through, like, through like precedents that were set during that time. So how do you feel like what do you feel like are like the major differences between like the social movements nowadays versus the social movements during the civil rights movement, and like the effectiveness in implementing demosprudence into jurisprudence or legisprudence?
So I talked about this a little bit in the talk, in that it's really, the difference I see is really on point 4, which is this idea that the successful rule change has to come from a legal partnership. And that's where I get off the boat completely with the legal scholarship, because even though I'm trained as a lawyer, I don't think lawyers are the ones, or legal elites are the ones who are the most qualified to understand the unique socio-legal demands of everyday people. I think they're conduits, because the system has created a necessity for a conduit as a way to protect itself. But I think that what we need to be doing is, and this is why I add this slide at the end, is that what we need to be doing is we need to be analyzing the voices of these movements just as carefully as we analyze Supreme Court decisions and every other court decision. Because what these movements are saying is that this is not where the law comes from. The law comes from us. And I think that that's something that we forget. And that's something that you're definitely not trained to think about in law school. The law comes from the courts. We're taught to rule by precedent. But whose precedent? To protect whom and why? So it's complicated, it's not perfect. I'm trying to take very different things and put them together. And I know that it's not perfect, but it's a way for me to kind of just ask hard questions that I don't have perfect answers to. But just because I don't, doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to talk it out. Jacob.
So, theory and practice. So theory sounds great. Practice sounds much more difficult. First of all, one of the reasons these social movements worked in the 60s is because we were operating on a totally black-white binary in those days. Native history's been erased, basically, from people's consciousness in the United States. They have no sense of that consciousness. And in fact, property law, Western law, has been imposed on Native communities that operated in a typically totally different agenda. So we have the Latino community now, Latina, we have the Black community, we have the Asian American community, we have Native communities. And there are obviously issues that divide these communities in all kinds of ways. The law in the United States is basically based on individualism and property. So Black Lives Matter comes basically out of the civil rights movement that locates itself in that dynamic, whereas Native issues don't locate themselves in that dynamic whatsoever. I'm thinking of just conflicts that show these divisions, both unities and conflicts. I'm thinking of the Seminole Wars, in which blacks escaped slaves and free blacks were united with the Seminole Indians, and the longest war in the United States history, 40 years, to resist slavery, and then also to resist the Trail of Tears, dispossession, ethnic cleansing. But I'm also thinking of the Cherokee Freedmen case, which I've been working on, in which natives are opposed to black people who have treaty rights signed in 1866 to be part of the Cherokee Nation and been dispossessed of those rights. So the question for me always, and then we could talk about, if you go out to New Mexico, where I spend a lot of time, there is absolutely no identification between the Latino, they don't even call them, they call themselves Hispanics because those folks trace themselves back to the conquest, and if you call them Chicano, Chicana, or you call them Latino, Latina, they look at you like you're crazy or ought to be shot. Okay, so their identification is with conquest. Whereas, of course, the Native identification in the Southwest is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 and the complete opposition to conquest. So when we're talking about a demos, I think, Andrew raised his question. The question is, and he brought up the Tea Party, but I'm also thinking, what demos are we talking about? I mean, the problem to me in this theory is it assumes two things. It assumes that there's a homogenized demos, and there isn't. And then it assumes that the law is something we all understand, right? Which we don't. And I mean that we don't, I mean that from a different communal sorts of standpoints. So those are my questions. The theory sounds great. The practice sounds extraordinarily complicated and fraught with immense problems. And one of those problems, I think, is the fact that you go to Canada and then you jump back to the United States, because the bridge there doesn't seem to me is such an easy bridge to build. I'm also thinking of Bolivia, places where you can unify. They're around certain indigenous values. And the United States seems to me to present, because of the history here, and because of the powerful denial, the United States seems to me to present a really problematic case of implementing something like this.
And I think that's why I'm trying to think about it, because it's so hard. But I think that so many people in this conversation broadly would understand that it's also so necessary, right? And so I agree with all of your kind of complaints about it's like it's imperfections.
Well, let's call them critiques, not complaints.
But I guess I'm intending their complaints because I have complaints with it. I'm looking for something better, but I don't know of something better other than starting a conversation about what we do.
Yeah. So one of the things I've noticed, since I'm on social media all the time, is that there's been pushback to Black Lives Matter from Red Lives Matter. You get people saying, look, Native peoples are imprisoned at a more disproportionate rate than Black people. What about all the murders by police of Native people that occur every day? Why is it? And this is not Bernie Sanders saying, oh, all lives matter. I'm not saying that, even though they do on some really abstract and meaningless level. I'm saying that Red Lives Matter, or Native Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter aren't coalescing in certain kinds of ways. The complaint here is that Black Lives Matter is actually erased. For example, Latino Lives Matter or Red Lives Matter, that sort of thing. That to me is a problem that you can see every day on social media. I mean, I post this stuff when it comes out of the Native community. So anyway.
Marsha, Adrian, have
yes. So I don't know how to put this succinctly, but I'll try. I guess I'm on the other end of this spectrum, if there is a spectrum, and seeing how generative this is, particularly because of my own work trying to categorize, define Black feminist citizenship and what that looks like. And so looking at jurisprudence and just thinking particularly of the Schoolhouse Rock version as a government, right? So I don't know, legislators, they make laws, executives, they sign laws, judicial, they, whatever, veto laws. And thinking about how the different aspects of government can translate in this era for me, or on a smaller level, and how the legislative would be jurisprudence, and how important that is to the communities that I come from. And the judicial would actually be social media, and how important Black Twitter is in conversations like this. And so that was really generative, and I really appreciated listening to you talk about things like that, because I do think that people often leave social movements outside of the legal conversations and act as though they exist on the periphery when they don't, and they're so very much in conversation with what's happening legally. And I think when I define legal, I would classify most social justice movements as operating in a system of human rights, and legal in that way, and not necessarily the American government idea of legal, which is often illegal in my count. So I think that that's important also to this conversation. And thinking, and I liked the pairing particularly because people often talk about these communities in opposition, and they're not always in opposition. So yeah. So comments more than questions.
Well, my thought was just in response to, social media is such an incredible space, and it's also such a messy and complex space. And so, depending on where you're sitting in some of these conversations and following various hashtags, there are powerful strands, and I can't quantify or weight them, but of Black Lives Matter movement that explicitly and regularly discuss the United States as a settler colony. And work hard to reach out. I mean, again, how do you quantify it? Maybe, but you know, that discourse is very prevalent in these communities, at least where I enter them, and in this movement, both in terms of acknowledging the land on which literally we're standing, and having these conversations, and this government with which we engage, or how do we engage it. So both within this land, but also reaching out, for instance, to Palestine, or to recognizing settler colonialism as part of the structure that is being resisted. And so it depends on how you define the black within Black Lives Matter, and that's contested in and of itself, right? Blackness is resistance to whiteness in certain definitions, and so there are very narrow definitions of conversations happening. They're also incredibly broad and very generative possibilities that I think people are reaching for. And again, it's imperfect, it's not finished. What does that mean? But it's certainly there.
And the reason why I think Torres and Guinier's construction of jurisprudence works for them in the confines of their 88 pages is because they're looking at something that they call finished. They're looking back at a historical moment, and they're picking up and saying, these are the pieces that we can see very clearly, and we're going to build a theory about a finished moment. And so that's not sufficient for me and for many of us whose work is really invested in the who we are now and in all of its messiness, but I think in all of its like ability to be really transformative. So they say we can, and they specifically say, we look back and we see this kind of really neatly packaged thing, and we've developed this theory from that, although we know it isn't very neatly packaged. But if someone can find something else in the law that's doing this sort of dance and having this conversation and really demanding something else, like, please send it to me, because I like read law review articles all the time, looking for just a line, just 2 lines.
Actually, it was more a question that I did have that I didn't ask. And it's not necessarily one that you should have an answer to now, but where do you see this paper or this work that you're doing in conversations of like critical race theory? Are they similar conversations, like things like that? Very broad question.
Perhaps if we could also, Lisa, you had a question, and we'll
Sorry.
put one more on the table to close.
Well, I just want to, I appreciate very much what you all are saying about the complexities of social media, and I was thinking, just kind of amplifying things you're already saying, or adding, I don't know, not saying something different, but more about it. It's significant, right? You bring this up and we don't have time to get into it, that it's women that are starting both of these things. And they have a very broad and multifaceted thing. And then what people do with that requires this constant pushback of like, no, what Black Lives Matters is this. We're talking about, you know, trans violence, we're talking anti-trans violence, we're talking about misogyny, we're talking about all these things. And people keep reducing it down to that kind of version of a property, black, white, whatever. Or I don't know more, it's like we're talking about all kinds of forms of violence against the land or whatever. Okay, now we're going to talk it, you know, take it back to here. So it's like the problem is multiplied by social media, which is so curated by who you choose to network. So my version of the social media has Indigenous people that are fully working out anti-Black violence and Black folks that are like trying to deal with settler colonialism. But when I see other people's glimpses of their feeds, a hair stands up because it's so hideous. So I don't know how we're going to have this demos of collectivity when we're actually like running in these very narrow streams that are getting more and more polarized, it seems, and scary. It's
But
kind
I
of
think
terrifying.
also my like optimistic hope is that at least the people who are in this room can look at each other as like people that you know on this campus who are maybe considering these kinds of questions. And so you'll say hello to each other, right, in this room before you leave. And then when you're out on campus, you'll be like, oh, they were at that talk, well, more. Maybe we can like share different conversations, and we can continue to kind of think about the complexity of these issues because they're unfolding, right? This is not done. This work is not done. This work is centuries old. It's complex. It's messy. It's dangerous in a lot of ways. But I think these kinds of conversations together is really kind of the hope of what I intended to do. So the purpose of this is for me not to tell you something that you don't already know, but to maybe read them together in a moment where you ask hard questions with me. because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to ask hard questions because it's important. Because these two communities are bound together in a really complicated way that I don't think we sit down together enough to talk about.
Well, with that, I would welcome you to say hello to each other over some snacks. We'll take the next 15 minutes or so to share. Teresa, thank you again for a very rich conversation.